The house creaked like an old ship adrift in time, its bones brittle and weary from years of solitude. John Simmons shuffled through the hallway, his slippers making soft, dragging sounds against the wooden floor. At 82, he had grown used to the rhythms of stillness, the kettle whistling in the morning, the whisper of wind against the windows, the occasional thud of a book slipping off a shelf by itself. His days were repetitions of the same silence, replaying like a looped reel of forgotten film. Ever since his wife Grace passed, the house had seemed to exhale, slowly deflating into memory. The attic was the only place he hadn't dared to revisit. It sat above him like a sealed tomb, full of boxes and remnants of another life, photographs that hurt too much to see, toys his daughter once held, letters never sent. But on this particular morning, something felt different. He awoke not to the sound of birds or boiler clicks, but to a whisper, soft, deliberate, unmistakably calling his name. It was not a dream. It lingered in his ears long after his eyes had opened. He sat in bed for a moment, heart thrumming like a low drumbeat in his chest, before pulling on his worn cardigan and making his way toward the stairs. The attic door loomed at the end of the hallway, its key, long forgotten, already in his hand, though he had no memory of picking it up. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the door and stepped into the gloom. Dust hung thick in the air, dancing like lost souls in the shaft of morning light that pierced through a narrow window. Old trunks lined the walls, a rocking horse lay sideways, one eye missing, and shelves sagged under the weight of untold stories. But in the center of the room stood something he was certain had never been there before. A tall, elegant grandfather clock, its wooden frame dark and glossy like polished mahogany. It was covered in a yellowing sheet, the kind that absorbs age and sadness, but something about the shape beneath it felt too deliberate, too alive. With hesitant fingers, he pulled back the fabric. The clock emerged like a memory made flesh. Intricate carvings spiraled around its face, and its glass was immaculate, untouched by time or dust. But what truly struck him, what made his throat tighten, was the motion of the clock hands. They moved slowly, steadily, counterclockwise, not in chaos, not in disorder, but in perfect, precise reverse. As he stared, his own breath seemed to pull backward into his chest. He blinked and felt a tear slide up into his eye. John stumbled back, almost tripping over an old rug. He sat down on a low trunk, his knees too weak to hold him, and kept watching. The clock ticked on, not bothering to explain itself. In that moment, the attic no longer felt like a storage place. It felt alive, observant, and deeply, deeply patient. John whispered to no one in particular, "What are you?" And somewhere within the ticking, he thought he heard an answer, faint but familiar, like Grace's voice, echoing through the folds of time. John didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, persistent ticking of the grandfather clock above him. It shouldn't have been audible from the attic, but he heard it clearly, each backward tick echoing like a countdown. When dawn finally arrived, he expected to find the attic empty, convinced it had all been a figment of tired grief. But when he climbed the stairs again, the clock stood exactly where he had left it, ticking in perfect reverse, its hands now an hour earlier than the last time he'd seen them. Curious and unnerved, John made tea, just as he did every morning, but the radio didn't play the usual morning broadcast. Instead, it aired a program he remembered from yesterday. The same cheerful host, the same weather forecast, the same stumble over a word he had laughed at the day before. He froze, the mug trembling in his hand. He thought perhaps it was a repeat, but then he noticed the newspaper on his doorstep. The headline was the same one he had already read, down to the last comma. The paper wasn't old or yellowed. It was fresh. Today was yesterday. He spent the rest of the morning in silence, testing the world. He rechecked the calendar, listened to voicemails he had already deleted, and even called the grocery store to ask what date it was. The teenager on the phone said Tuesday, the same Tuesday John had already lived. The same Tuesday he remembered spilling tea on his pants and forgetting to water the plants. He looked at his trousers, stained in exactly the same way. The soil in his pots was still dry. The world hadn't reset. He had. Or maybe somehow, the clock had pulled the world backward with him. By evening, his hands trembled as he returned to the attic. The clock still ticked in reverse, but now it was 2 days behind. His fingers brushed its glass face, and he swore the air around it was colder. "Are you doing this?" he whispered, but the clock only answered in backward seconds. That night, he placed a photo of Grace beside the clock, one where she was laughing in the garden, hair wrapped in a scarf, eyes brighter than summer. He spoke to it softly, as if it were alive, as if it could remember. He wanted to believe that if time was moving backward, then maybe, just maybe, she was still somewhere behind him, waiting. On the third day, or rather, the third yesterday, John finally decided to act. He had stopped pretending that it was coincidence. The clock was doing something unnatural, bending time like a slow spiral inward. That morning, instead of following his usual routine, he sat at his writing desk and retrieved an old, yellowed piece of stationery. It had been meant for Grace, a letter he had once started but never finished after her diagnosis. He remembered writing the first sentence, then losing the courage to continue, as if the final words might seal her fate. But now, as time slipped backwards, he wondered, what if he finished it now? What if he'd mailed it? His hands shook as he wrote, the words coming slower than he expected. They weren't poetic or clever, just honest. Apologies he had never spoken aloud, memories he feared only he still carried. He signed it shakily and placed it in an envelope, sealing it with the same wax stamp they had used on their wedding invitations. The postbox down the road felt strangely distant, as if walking to it meant crossing into a different kind of world. The air was colder. The birds watched him from the wires with unnatural stillness. He dropped the envelope in and whispered, "Please find her." That night, he had a dream. Not quite a dream, more like a memory warped into clarity. Grace was there, younger, standing in the kitchen in her favorite green sweater, humming a song he hadn't heard in decades. She turned to him and smiled, but her eyes looked confused, as if she could sense something out of place. When he reached out to touch her, the dream cracked like glass, and he woke up gasping in the attic. The clock stood before him, now showing time 3 days behind the present. The house had changed. A painting he remembered removing after her death was back on the hallway wall. The guest bedroom smelled like her perfume, lavender and old rose. He found an old grocery list in her handwriting on the kitchen counter. None of it had been there yesterday. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. Was he simply losing himself to grief? Or was time, in its reversed flow, slowly reconstructing the past piece by piece? But the shift wasn't all comforting. The phone rang that afternoon, and when he picked it up, there was no sound, only static, and then a voice, his own voice, whispering a phrase he couldn't fully make out. It repeated twice before the line went dead. Then the lights flickered. The shadows in the hallway moved as if breathing. For the first time, John felt afraid, not of the clock, but of what might be coming with time. John stood in front of the clock, the air around it now colder than the rest of the house. His breath fogged slightly in the attic, despite the warm June weather outside. The tick of the backward time had become the only rhythm he could hear, louder even than his heartbeat. He had lost track of how many days had reversed now. 5? 6? The calendar meant nothing anymore. But this morning, he woke with a certainty he hadn't felt before. He was close. Close to the day Grace died. He stared at the photograph of her still resting beside the clock. Her eyes smiled in frozen light, and John whispered to it, "One more day. Let me see her. Let me try." He didn't know what he would say or what difference it would make, but the idea of doing nothing felt unbearable. He began speaking to the clock as if it were an old friend, or perhaps a god. "Take me there," he said. "I'll give up everything else." And as if in answer, the minute hand twitched. The house shifted subtly that day. The couch in the living room had reverted to an older fabric pattern, one they had replaced years ago. Her slippers, small, lavender, waited beside the bed, perfectly aligned. In the kitchen, John found a list titled "Doctor's Appointment, 11 a.m." His breath caught in his chest. That was the day of the diagnosis, the day she found out, and the beginning of the end. Everything after that had become a blur of hospital lights and soft-spoken apologies. He stayed upstairs most of the afternoon, afraid that if he went too far, he might meet her too soon. But in the evening, he found himself standing in the hallway outside their bedroom. The door was cracked open. Candlelight flickered from within. And there she was. Grace, not a dream, not a ghost, sitting in the chair by the window, reading. Her hair was grayer than in his dreams, but her presence was undeniable. He wanted to run to her, hold her, tell her everything, but he didn't. He was paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. Instead, he simply stood and watched, tears quietly falling. Grace looked up as if sensing something, but her gaze passed through him. It wasn't him she saw. Not yet. The clock hadn't finished. Time had brought her back, but not him. He realized with a terrible clarity that he was only a visitor now. An echo in a home that once belonged to two. If he pushed further, would he be able to change things? Or would it unravel everything? Later that night, he returned to the attic. The clock now ticked louder than ever. Its hands were nearing midnight, backwards. He understood now. The moment they crossed that line, the day would reset once more, and he might have a chance to step back into the past as himself. But something else was coming with it. He could feel it. Something cold, watching, waiting for him to make a choice. Time was not giving. It was trading. The night stretched long and restless, the kind of night where time seems to shiver instead of pass. John sat in the attic, knees drawn to his chest like a child hiding from a storm, staring at the clock. Its hands were now within seconds of midnight, creeping backward like a hunter preparing to strike. He could feel the room pulsing with something ancient, something not just watching, but waiting. Every second seemed to whisper a promise and a warning at once. He had made his decision. He would not let Grace face that day alone again. He would be there. He would tell her everything, warn her, change the course of time. As the final second ticked in reverse and the chimes began to ring, John stepped forward and touched the glass. It was ice cold. A flash of light, colorless and blinding, swallowed him whole. And suddenly, he was there. The kitchen was full of morning sun. The calendar on the wall read, May 14th, the day everything had changed. He stood at the sink, holding a dish towel, and it felt so natural, so real. His body was younger, less stiff, less broken. He looked at his hands and barely recognized them. Grace called to him from the hallway, asking where she left her keys. It was her voice, alive, textured, vibrant. He turned, and for the first time in years, she looked at him and saw him. They embraced. It wasn't a dream. Over breakfast, he tried to explain. He told her about the clock, the days repeating, the warning. At first, she laughed gently, thinking it was a joke. But as he described details no one else could know, her doctor's words, the scans, the pain, her laughter died. Fear crept into her eyes, but something else too. Belief. Love makes even the impossible feel familiar. She didn't ask why he had come back, only what they could do next. They didn't go to the doctor's office. Instead, they packed a small bag and drove out of town, past the forests they used to hike in, to a lakeside motel they had visited once when they were young. For 2 days, it felt like time had truly given them a second chance. They talked for hours. They danced to old records. They fell asleep holding hands. But deep inside, John knew time was never meant to bend. On the third night, the clock reappeared. It stood silently in the motel room, by the dresser, ticking backward again. Grace saw it too. She whispered, "It found us." The lights dimmed. Outside, the lake stood completely still, reflecting nothing. The air grew heavy, thick with pressure and silence. And then came the knock on the door, slow, deliberate, hollow. Not a person, not a voice, just time collecting its due. Grace looked at John and smiled, tears in her eyes. "You gave me something no one else could, but now you have to go." He begged, pleaded, but she only kissed him gently and walked toward the clock. As she touched its glass, John was pulled backward again, weightless and screaming inside, until he landed, gasping, on the attic floor. The photograph was gone. The house was silent. The clock was still. Its hands no longer moved. It had taken her again, but this time, on its own terms. The attic was silent. The clock no longer ticked. The hands stood frozen at a time that no longer mattered, neither past nor future. John sat in the dust, his fingers curled around nothing, his breath ragged. It had taken her. Again. But this time, there was no promise of return, no dream, no memory softening the blow. Only the stillness of a house that had remembered too much. He spent the next few days drifting through the halls like a ghost. The house had changed again, subtly. Her things were gone, not as if she had died, but as if she had never existed at all. No wedding photos, no perfume, no tea tins labeled in her handwriting, only the faint outline of a picture frame on the wall, empty. Only the echo of a voice he could barely recall. The world had rewritten itself. He tried to explain to others, to the clerk at the post office, to the grocer, to the pastor who used to lead Grace's choir, but none of them remembered her. Not her face, not her name. Not even John seemed entirely familiar to them. Time had not only taken her, it had taken his place beside her, as if it had all been a mistake, and now the universe was quietly correcting it. He returned to the attic once more, searching for the clock, but it was gone. All that remained was a small outline in the dust, shaped like its base, as if it had simply faded, and in its place, something lay folded, a piece of paper. John unfolded it slowly. It was the letter he had written, the one he had mailed to Grace, except now it was addressed to him in her handwriting. "Time bends for no one, my love, but it listens. You gave me something more than extra days. You gave me the knowledge that I was remembered, and for that, I traded my place in the story so you could remain. Live it well. Don't chase what was. Love what is." Tears spilled freely. He pressed the letter to his chest, but no warmth came from it. Outside, a soft wind moved the trees. Birds sang a song he no longer remembered. The world was whole again, but without her. And yet, somehow the pain was quieter. Not gone, but gentler. He would carry her absence like a second heart, beating silently alongside his own. Years passed. Seasons folded into each other like pages of a long-forgotten book. John aged alone, never remarried, never left the town. But he lived gently, tended a garden, spoke kindly. Sometimes he would pause, hand over his chest, and smile at something no one else could see. And on the day he finally passed, peacefully in sleep, the clock returned. Just for a moment. It ticked once, then stopped.